Great, good morning. Everyone got a seat? Delighted to see you. Always delighted to see a full house, but I caught snippets of conversation this morning of no trains and planes stuck on the tarmac, entirely relevant to the conversation we're about to have. Good morning, I'm Bronwyn Maddox, I'm Director of the Institute for Government, and I'm really delighted to be having this event this morning, which not only marks the launch of our 6th infrastructure report in a year, the one, I'm going to wave it at you, how to transform infrastructure decision making in the UK, but is really the culmination of about a year's work for the Institute, led by Nick Davies with Graham Atkins, Tess Kidney-Bishop and Daniel Slade. Terrific team. And I was discussing with Lilian Greenwood MP, who's joined us very kindly to discuss it. I was discussing before we came up here why we'd done this. I started at the Institute not quite a year and a half ago, and this was one of the things I really wanted us to work on, because there is so much proper discussion about why the country keeps being presented with a choice between something big, expensive and late, or nothing at all. And I thought we ought to dig into the process of this. And indeed the team has done that, looking at the process, at cost-benefit analysis, at the financing, and all kinds of aspects of the decision making about how we can end up with better infrastructure decisions, and not with white elephants, and not with nothing at all. So how this morning is going to work, Nick Davies is going to talk for about 10 minutes and set out this latest report. I'm going to discuss it with Lilian Greenwood. Lilian, as you know, is been the MP for Nottingham South since 2010 and is also chair of the Transport Select Committee. I'm really delighted to have you with us. Thank you. But first I'm going to hand over to Milagros Mostaza from the Project Management Institute, and we're delighted to have had the Project Management Institute as partners throughout this piece of work, injecting a lot of thought and dialogue. And would you like to say a few words about why this, I would come up here in fact and speak about why this work has been good for you.
Thank you. And thank you for having the opportunity to have collaborated with you in this report. Project Management Institute is the leading project management association in the world, and we support worldwide more than 1 million members and certification holders. And our mission is to really promote the use of project management as a strategic competency. Therefore, when we talk about infrastructure, of course, it's very, very relevant, and that's why we're very pleased to contribute to these kind of reports, but also to the discussions that are taking place here in the UK and in other parts of the world. Actually, with our research and thought leadership, we try to contribute to the thinking process that countries are having everywhere, really. I mean, each country has different challenges, but we want to contribute to share those experiences. We collaborate as well with the World Economic Forum, specifically on infrastructure discussions, so we will be very pleased to share as well the work we're doing with them and the experiences that other governments are having in other parts of the world. So with that, again, thank you so much, and look forward to the presentation, and I'm sure it's going to be very useful for everybody.
Thank you very much. Great. And then with that, Nick, you want to take it away?
Good morning, and thank you for coming to the launch of this, as Bronwyn said, the 6th report that we've published as part of a year-long investigation into infrastructure policy making. The report pulls together and synthesises the findings from across this work to make final recommendations on how government can make the right decisions about critical infrastructure sectors such as transport, energy, flood defences, water and waste. I'm going to focus on 3 key issues today, though of course there's substantially more detail in the report, a summary of which you have in front of you. So first, the importance of taking a long-term approach to infrastructure policy making. Second, making the right finance choices and getting a good deal. And third, engaging the public. So starting with taking a long-term approach to infrastructure policy making. Infrastructure decisions by successive governments have been inconsistent and subject to constant change. This is to an extent an inevitable consequence of our democratic system, and it would not be possible nor desirable to take the politics out of infrastructure. Yet, to be effective, infrastructure policy must be long-term and provide certainty for industry, investors and the public. And squaring this circle is a key challenge. The starting point must be a widely agreed evidence base on what the country's infrastructure needs actually are. And the National Infrastructure Commission was established to do just that and has made a very positive start. But its success is far from assured. Its longevity and its impact will depend on its credibility across party lines, and that requires work. Most importantly, its independence must be assured. While it has acted independently to date, this has been largely due to its leadership rather than its organisational form as an executive agency of the Treasury. Like other independent bodies that provide advice, such as the OBR or the Committee on Climate Change, we think it should be established as a non-departmental public body, so it's got greater independence. Equally, given the sensitivity of infrastructure investment decisions, it must be seen to represent a range of views. While the current commissioners are all respected experts in their fields, they're all also somewhat London-centric and are quite heavily weighted towards economists. There are currently a number of spare commissioner slots, and the Chancellor should prioritise injecting a bit of diversity when making further appointments. The first proper test of the NIC's effectiveness will be the response to the publication of the first National Infrastructure Assessment, which is due this summer, particularly the response from the government. The government, we think, should use the National Infrastructure Assessment as the basis for a cross-cutting national infrastructure strategy, and that this should be a key tool for coordinating infrastructure policy and projects across Whitehall and different levels of government. Within central government alone, as this chart shows, there are 8 departments and 26 ministers with official responsibility for infrastructure policy. Below this, there are combined authorities, local authorities, LEPs, and from April, subnational transport bodies, all of which have infrastructure roles. This requires coordination that is currently lacking. Even where there are supposed national strategies, these tend to actually be long shopping lists of policies, but provide little sense of how they're meant to fit together. There needs to be a clear framework for prioritising projects and coordinating the work of the numerous arms of government. This is particularly important for large national projects such as HS2, where realising all the potential benefits depends on a wide number of central and local government bodies working together. So the National Infrastructure Strategy, we think, should do 3 things in particular. 1, it must clearly explain how accepted recommendations from the National Infrastructure Assessment interact with existing plans such as the Industrial Strategy and national policy statements to achieve government's infrastructure objectives. 2, it should set out how the capacity of subnational bodies such as combined authorities and subnational transport bodies will be developed, and the formal arrangements by which central government will work with them, and that could be modelled, for example, on the arrangements that have been set out for working with Transport for the North. And 3, it needs to be explicit about the extent to which different parts of the country will benefit from investment decisions. The question of investment decisions brings me on to the second overall point that I'd like to make: the importance of getting a good deal on finance, i.e. the money that's used to meet the upfront costs of infrastructure. The UK needs greater investment in infrastructure, but at the moment, as Bronwyn said, it often ends up costing us more than it should. There are various reasons for this, but 2 finance-related ones are critical. The bias towards private finance and ineffective negotiation and management of private finance contracts. Both of these are particularly relevant in light of Carillion's collapse, which seemingly was partly due to losses on private finance deals. So let's start with the bias towards private finance. The government system of accounting, appraisal and budgeting, we have found, has created perverse incentives to use private finance, even where it doesn't represent long-term value for money. And as a result, we have more off-balance sheet public-private partnerships than any other leading EU country. And I'd like to highlight 4 recommendations that we've made for overcoming this. First, government must be much more transparent, publishing comparisons between different finance options for individual projects and the impact of private finance projects using wider measures of public sector debt, which show PFI and PF2 liabilities. Second, government must get much better at collecting, collating and analysing data on private finance deals. One of the big problems with this debate is we have so little evidence about the whole life costs of private versus publicly financed projects. Third, Treasury budgeting processes should leave fiscal headroom for projects which emerge outside of the spending review cycle to prevent departments defaulting to private finance. And fourth, although there has been significant progress in improving the government's commercial skills, there's more work to be done. In particular, there remains a lack of awareness of the commercial and finance specialisms among departmental leadership teams. Even where private finance could provide better value for money, the government is not doing enough to realise these benefits, and it's certainly not doing enough to meet its stated objective of increasing the volume of private investment in UK infrastructure. Most pressingly, the absence of a clear pipeline of projects creates investor uncertainty, reduces the number of potential investors, reducing competition for contracts, eroding investor confidence in government, and leading ultimately to higher costs for taxpayers and consumers. A new PF2 pipeline was promised by the Chancellor in the 2016 autumn statement, but is yet to arrive. If government's serious about getting more private investment at a good price, then this must be published ASAP. The third overall point I'd like to make is about engaging the public. Too often in the UK, the government's approach has been to streamline consultation processes. But if communities do not feel they've had a genuine say on projects, then they often oppose them entirely, resulting in delays which can cost millions of pounds. Yet the evidence from the UK and abroad shows that taking a more structured approach to conflict resolution can be beneficial for government and communities alike. In our report, we cite the example of France's National Commission for Public Debate, which, despite having no formal powers to enforce its recommendations, has provided a route through which communities can have their say and make a meaningful difference to major infrastructure projects. So as shown on here, the two green bars are where significant changes have been made to projects in France as a result of the CNDB consultation process. So we propose creating a similar independent body here, a commission for public engagement that we think should do three things. One, facilitate in-depth deliberations with representative, randomly selected panels of citizens which would discuss policy options for inclusion in the government's national infrastructure strategy. Two, when national policy statements are developed or updated, this body could facilitate public debates with local communities that are likely to be affected by the resulting major infrastructure projects. And three, it could provide advice to project sponsors during the pre-application consultation stage of the nationally significant infrastructure project planning regime. Such a body could be established cheaply and without disruption to the existing major project planning process, giving communities a real say, providing greater certainty to government and other scheme promoters, and reducing delays that can run to hundreds of millions of pounds. None of this is to say that these decisions are easy. Investment in infrastructure raises fundamental political questions, and the projects themselves can be hugely complex. But while government has made improvements, there's much more that could be done. Today's report and the previous 5, which look in detail at issues such as the use of cost-benefit analysis, public versus private finance, and the politics of infrastructure decision-making, provide some practical recommendations on further recommendations that could be made. Thank you.
Nick, many thanks indeed, and lots I'm sure we'll pick up in questions from the superiority of one form of finance over another or not, to various ways of making decisions. I want to start with one thing though, the National Infrastructure Commission. It was set up precisely to help this kind of thing. How do you think it's worked?
I mean, I think it's incredibly welcome development. I spent a lot of time in the last Parliament kind of discussion meetings like this where we were talking about if only we had a sort of long-term strategy for the development of infrastructure that tried to take some of the politics out of these decisions. So I think the very fact of us having a National Infrastructure Commission in place now to try and do that, to try and look beyond the normal sort of political cycles of decision making is really helpful, but I don't think its future is yet assured. We've still got to see whether the process is going to properly work for us in terms of is it going to have that independence? Are government going to listen and respond appropriately when we get that national infrastructure assessment this year? So I'm optimistic but cautious, I think is probably the right word.
It's lost two heads, Andrew Adonis and Michael Heseltine, not over infrastructure-related reasons, it seems to me, over Brexit-related and other disagreements. What do you think is the strongest thing it's done so far?
I mean, I think just the very fact of it being there and identifying what the challenges are and being able to kind of speak about those and communicate those to the wider public. So sort of that gaining that understanding that it is about congestion, it's about capacity, it's about the digital future. I think it gives people a very clear view about what are the things that our country needs to do. And it also demonstrates the importance that we attach to infrastructure and to infrastructure planning. I think the fact that it's lost two very clear and outspoken chairs is a worry, because you know, we need to have someone with independence and with the real sort of authority and clout to drive its work forward. So I think that's what will be making people a little anxious.
Nick was talking about the need for consensus. You're chair of the Transport Select Committee. We're not meeting at a time of great cross-party sort of harmony at the moment, but what do you think the appetite is for cross-party agreement on these kind of things?
I mean, I think we all recognise that that when you can't achieve political consensus, when things become a political football, it does hold us back. And at the moment, one of the pieces of work that we're doing in the Select Committee is, of course, scrutinising the airport's national policy statement. And I feel, as a committee, we've very much kind of left the politics behind in terms of trying to do our scrutiny role. And when you look at the sort of history of trying to agree around airports expansion, I think it's a really good example of why things don't work and about how politics gets in the way. You know, I mean, the idea of a third runway at Heathrow expansion was first mooted back in the 1940s. It was seriously on the table from 2003, and we've seen how it's been delayed just in the last couple of decades. It became a political issue, a party political issue within the 2010 election. It was then, you know, the incoming government decided to try and take the politics out of it by setting up the Airports Commission, but obviously nervous of the politics, kicked that decision to, you know, made sure the Airports Commission wasn't going to report until after the 2015 election. Then there was a further delay down to the, well, it seemed pretty clear, down to the fact of the London mayoral election. I think it's a really good example of when politics and making a decision on something that's clearly really important is addressing that capacity issue within the aviation market.
And I would argue this isn't going to be a debate simply about Heathrow and airports, but argue that the question of costs, it got lost in the politics. I mean, the particularly high costs of the current Heathrow proposition. That is a subject for another debate. And so just finally in this, I mean, Nick making the pitch for a commission for public engagement, do you think that would help, again, take some of the politics out of this, bring the public into these decisions?
I mean, I think that's one of the really interesting parts of the report, because even where we have made big infrastructure decisions, so I think some things have moved on. So in terms of HS2, which is something I'd kind of been on the edges of as a sort of shadow transport minister in the last parliament, is that politicians finally made a decision, but I'm not convinced that the argument with the public has necessarily been won, both in terms of the broader public, because one of the points I think you make is that decisions can be held up by the concentrated losers. It's almost like we've made that decision, and obviously there have been some important changes made to the scheme to try to reflect the concerns of those other losers, but I'm not sure that we've really won the argument about the wider benefits with the public who stand to gain from the kind of rebalancing of the economy and changing the national connectivity. So it's been won with sort of city leaders, or it's been won with business, but not with the wider public. And I think that's really important, because people need to understand understand, particularly where we're spending large amounts of public money, they need to understand and value it. And I think perhaps Crossrail's an example of where I feel like there is an understanding and a pride in that investment that's happening, but I'm not sure we're there on other areas, and I think that the suggestion is a really welcome one. It'd be really interesting to see how that develops.
We'll explore that in the future. Nick, the word Carillion hangs over a lot of discussions of public versus private at the moment, and that is obviously an enormous debate which spans the regulated utilities right through to outsourcing of services and so on, and the PFI questions, just one subsector of that. So I don't want to try and encompass all that, but you just take us through, in particular, the data that would allow us to say with more confidence what works and what doesn't work. Obviously, private finance brings in private money into infrastructure building, and in theory allows more infrastructure than the government might otherwise be able to do. But the question is at what cost? So what is it we would really like to know in order to be able to assess whether it is better value for money?
Well, I think, as I said in my presentation, at the moment the debate around the use of PFI, PF2 and private finance generally is a bit of an evidence-free zone, unfortunately. There are certain things that we know about the use of private finance, which is that private borrowing is always going to be more expensive than government borrowing. So the big question is whether through those routes greater efficiencies can be delivered when building projects than the government would, and whether that outweighs the additional cost of capital that will be incurred through private finance. And
whether more projects,
Indeed.
Because of whatever constraints the government might feel there were on finances.
But unfortunately, the government has put not nearly enough effort into judging what the whole life costs of privately financed projects are versus publicly financed projects, and we might be able to do a little bit of that, as certainly some of the early PFI projects come back into the public sector at the end of their 25-30 year contracts. But actually, in order to do it properly, you probably need to build in evaluation from the start. You need to have comparable projects, publicly and privately financed, and measure those throughout their lifetime, so that you can make a proper assessment. And in some cases that will probably require adding kind of greater transparency clauses into our contracts with those financiers, so that government has access to all of the kind of the data and information that it needs in order to make a proper judgment.
I mean, by definition, when the projects go into the private sector, it becomes much harder to get hold of the information because it is in private contract. It's something we're pushing for here. We do a lot of work on outsourcing and so on, and have done for years, and that call for some of that data will be one of the things you'll hear from us this year. You just take us through some of the shortcomings and positives of cost-benefit analysis as the changes you'd like to see in it.
Yes, absolutely. So I think in the report we say that there's kind of international evidence that shows that mega projects, those worth over £1 billion, in 90% of cases tend to run over, both in terms of time and their costs. And there's a question of why is that, and how do you kind of overcome the optimism bias that tends to infect government assessment of how much these projects are going to cost. One of the things that we've called for is greater separation of the teams, so that those who are promoting projects are not the same people as those evaluating the assumptions that have been made about projections. So in some cases that is already happening. So in the Department for Transport, for example, they have a separate team that does that. But actually we think that that might be a role for the IPA, the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, to kind of independently assess the biggest projects being promoted. We also think there is a role for the IPA in that kind of collation of evidence. So whilst kind of use of private finance as an evidence-free zone, we're also not doing nearly enough to evaluate the biggest projects or projects full stop. We're not collecting the evidence, we're not collating it, and we're certainly not analysing it and using it to inform future evaluations or projections for how beneficial projects are going to be. And we think that could be a key role for the IPA there in doing that collection and collation.
Great, let's have some questions. I've got many more, but I suspected, as there are, quite a few here. All right, the first up was in the front, yep, the front row of that.
David Walker from Guardian Public. Your report, in many ways, is a sustained critique of the Treasury, isn't it? The Treasury's, it doesn't have to be Jacob Rees-Mogg to see that there are great gaps in Treasury capacity, but also an unwillingness on the part of the Treasury historically to allow departments the autonomy themselves. I mean, take data. Why is it that the Treasury, which apparently is in control of spending aggregates, seems curiously uninterested in finding out what's actually happening to public expenditure, measuring it and evaluating it? Any ideas as to why there's a black hole in terms of interest in data, let alone its collection?
It's a very good question, as you know perfectly well, best directed at the Treasury. We are beginning a project on the Treasury later this year directed precisely at this point of why it doesn't link up, if you like, performance with a spending, but simply issues a spending target. But perhaps both of you would like to chip in on this.
I mean, I do wonder whether one of the issues is a willingness to kind of admit when things haven't gone right and to learn from mistakes. I think one of the things that was really important in the report is that process of reflection and evaluation, of looking at what can we, looking back and learning from projects and looking back at where did we get it wrong and how could we make sure that we improve our modelling for the future. I think that's really important, and I think in a political context it's sometimes quite difficult to admit where things haven't gone well and to learn the lessons, because there's always a tendency to want to kind of put a gloss or a spin on it to explain why you've made a new decision or changed policy, rather than a bit of candour and honesty. So I think that's part of the problem, and it's sort of almost, maybe that's a bit inevitable with politics, but I think we could sometimes do with a bit more transparency so that we can actually be clear about why things have gone wrong and how we can learn from them and do better.
Yeah, just to say, I mean, I completely agree with you, and it's obviously not just in infrastructure, so it's a criticism that our performance tracker report also makes about the Treasury's management of expenditure on public services. I suppose you could say that there have been some improvements. Both the IPA, which I think has been a positive development, and the NIC are both bodies of the Treasury. So while certainly you're right, some of that kind of central expenditure management might still not be asking the right questions, there are parts of Treasury that I think are, and actually provide some positive hope for the future.
A big subject which we could explore for a bit. Here and then in the front, and then I'll come further back.
Okay, yes. Stephen Joseph, Campaign for Better Transport. How do you think you can solve what the Rod Eddington report of 10 years ago identified, which is a tendency to focus on big projects, even though packages of small-scale projects might have better value for money? I mean, this is a combination of economics, I think. Cost-benefit analysis tends to score small-scale stuff worse, but also the politics of people liking to cut ribbons on things, as opposed to, getting roads better maintained or getting better bus services or something less glamorous. I mean, Eddington identified that small-scale projects actually did look better in value for money. How do you think you could we can address that problem with this? Just to say, by the way, the Commission Public Debate idea I think is great, because as an environmental group we work with communities who exactly feel that they're being offered, as one person put it, a decision on never mind the question of whether your community is going to be completely destroyed by a road scheme. The question we want to consult you on is whether the fences should be painted white or green.
Terrific, great question. Let me say we have a very experienced audience here, full of practitioners. If people want to make points, I'm departing from the normal chair's instructions. People want to make points as well as ask questions. That is all to the good. Nick, do you want to?
Sorry, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think there is a challenge that some of the things that politicians are most interested in, and indeed that the public are most interested in, are the kind of big transformative changes to the economy, such as increased productivity, rebalancing the economy or increasing jobs. And actually, those types of changes are only really likely to come from the big mega projects which have those transformers. So I can see why there is a desire to look at them, though I agree that there is also a ribbon cutting bias. I think some of the recommendations that we would make to overcome that, in particular, was one of the reasons why we want a national infrastructure strategy. At the moment, there's kind of very little comparison between different projects and fitting them into kind of clear overall wider objectives. So it's one thing to say HS2 will increase capacity, it'll rebalance the economy, etc., etc., but there's very little comparison between HS2 and other transport projects, which might be smaller, and even less comparison between what DFT might be spending and other investments that could be made by DEFRA or BEIS or elsewhere. So I think having a clear strategy would enable a kind of clearer prioritisation, and I think that could hopefully lead to kind of prioritisation of some smaller projects. I would also say on the kind of the cost-benefit analysis point, some of the recommendations that we've made about kind of about greater transparency, about the evidence, about being clear on what the assumptions are, I think could also help towards that cause.
Lilian.
Yeah, I mean,
bias towards big things in politics.
I think it's a really important point, and I think there's a huge mismatch actually, because I certainly in terms of my constituents and what do they get irate about, it is definitely things like the state of our local roads. And just coming here this morning, cycling around trying to avoid the potholes. On the one hand, we've got a huge investment in sort of national road and our national road network, but then everybody's journey ends and begins and ends on local roads, and they're in a mess. And I think that is one of the issues that really concerns me, is how you can kind of make sure that you are looking at the things that are local and really significant to people, as well, in their local communities, as well as the sort of transformative things that you can do at a national level. But I do think that cost-benefit analysis can be really important in that, because particularly in the transport field, is often it's those interventions that you can make that affect things like cycling, walking, that actually have very high levels of BCRs. But it's how do you make those comparisons? Because at national level there is obviously tends to be a focus on the big national projects rather than thinking about what's the best way in which departmental budgets could be implemented to maximise the benefits for everybody. And of course also there's the sort of silo mentality that we get in departments, and I think one of the values of the select committees is increasingly select committees working together to try to in part to actually force government departments to look together at shared goals. And one of the recent one of those would be around air quality, and Treasury are absolutely pivotal in this as well, and making sure that all departments in terms of their planning are focused on common goals and not working at odds in terms of their policy direction.
Can I just pick up on that kind of collaboration point between select committees? Because I agree, I think that's really critically important. I think where that a really critical time for that is going to be after the publication of the National Infrastructure Assessment this summer, which is obviously going to cut across the work of at least 5 or 6 different select committees. So I really hope that the chairs are kind of talking about how they can work together to ensure that kind of the scrutiny is joined up on that.
Terrific. Here in the front. And then I'm coming, there's a cluster of people at the back. I'm coming to you all. We've got good time.
Caroline Shepherd, I'm the Chief Adjudicator of the Traffic Penalty Tribunal, and we deal with the penalties for not paying tolls on the Dartford Bridge and the Mersey Gateway Bridge, which is the most fantastic piece of engineering that's recently emerged. But the gloriousness of the engineering is completely now overshadowed by the chaos about imposing penalties and tolls and how this has been handled. And so the dissatisfaction discussion in the Northwest about this has completely taken over from any respect and admiration for the bridge itself. We also deal with local authorities and sort of shared space, infrastructure issues that nobody gives any thought to how they're going to enforce them, how they're going to make them fit into the community. Somebody somewhere, probably the Treasury, says that actually people should pay to use them. Obviously this feeds into road pricing, but nobody gives any thought as to how they're going to make that happen. They then hand the enforcement over to the private sector without any regard to actually the public authority approach to this. So then you get the private sector coming in who actually, on what we see, appear to make more out of it actually than the government or the local authorities, because of the way that the penalties are imposed. And then of course the public just see it as a tax, and of course ultimately it affects the most vulnerable in society because they can't really cope with the processes and land up with the bailiffs knocking on their door.
So are you against
I'm just saying it needs to be thought. No, not at all. But I just think it needs to be planned. When you're actually designing the infrastructure, doing your cost-benefit analysis, deciding on how to finance it, somebody right at that stage needs to be there saying, well, when it's all done and dusted, you know, what is going to be the impact on the local community, and shall we bring the community in to see the extent to which, you know, the nurses want to pay going each way to get to work in the morning across a new bridge.
All right, community impact, thanks, and the complexity of tolls. Right, there's someone right at the back in the window, and I'm coming to all these people in the back now.
Okay. Simon Webb from the Nichols Group. I was on Eddington with Rod, so perhaps I could have a go at whatever happened to Eddington. I think the lack of a major sort of political event is quite an important issue. But one of the things about Eddington, which is perhaps a harder thing, was that it was actually very much about demand-driven. So the reason the cost-benefit cases were so good was because there was somewhere where, whether it was a bypass or a small scheme or something, where there was an economic need for it, and so it drove the numbers into the cost-benefit case. But that was about meeting a demand. It wasn't about regeneration, which is what I'm about to get onto, which is to say regeneration is actually, you know, a topic we haven't really talked about, but is in some ways the most dangerous and attractive feature of all this, because the Treasury, of course, I worked in the Treasury, completely scarred by the Northeast, build the roads and they will leave, and don't believe in regeneration, basically. And actually, if you look at the Transport for the North publication last week, you might say, you know, there's some of it in there now. You know, it said everybody must have a share of this in the North. You know, everybody's got to have something for everybody, you know, even the part. So I think the point about demand-driven is the thing that was in Eddington, and is in some ways the hardest, because it's not about regeneration.
Thanks. I just want to pick up this point of regeneration, Nick and Lilian, because it's something that doesn't, it really is, it has to come down to a political decision, doesn't it? It isn't going to come out of a cost-benefit analysis, which isn't going to say, put more infrastructure in a region that may be very underdeveloped and may be struggling at the moment. The cost-benefit analysis isn't going to say you're going to make a lot of, you know, returns on that, is it? You're going to have to take a political decision to do that.
And it was one of the things we said in our report, that actually cost-benefit analysis is a useful tool to support decision making, but it's not the be-all and end-all. And as you say, there are kind of fundamentally political questions about where we invest, about rebalancing the economy, that CBA never suggests it could solve. To be honest, I think CBA gets quite a bad rap. It's a limited tool, but it is a useful one. And you know, you often hear politicians say, well, if we only relied on CBA, then we'd get nothing done at all. Or you get the converse, which is if you have a high benefit cost ratio, you say, well, this is the single number that justifies going ahead with this project. I don't think either of those is a particularly helpful approach, and there's always going to be a role for political leadership in this.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think you know, somewhat one of the projects we've been looking at, or one of the issues we've been looking at recently, has been electrification, where there seemed to be a decision and then there was an attempt to justify it later with the use of benefit cost ratios, where kind of we knew it felt like it had a very high benefit cost ratio, but actually I think DfT kind of worked out that the politics of cancelling it weren't going to be that difficult, and then they've had to kind of you know, post decision kind of try to justify it. I do think I mean, cost-benefit analysis is limited, and particularly because it tends to drive further investment to places that already have investment, that have already got high levels of demand. And we do, if we're serious about rebalancing the economy and trying to regenerate areas in the Midlands and the North, then we just do need to make that political decision that we are going to make that investment.
We've agreed on this. In the middle at the back.
Thank you. Hugh Lloyd. A few years ago, perhaps 10 years ago, I was involved in the Planning Act 2008-9, and we created the National Planning Policy Statements. I wonder whether this and that are part of a story that's got this the wrong way round, because we've created mechanisms and devices that force or encourage perhaps politicians and departments to concentrate on big things because they become parts of national infrastructure and they need the attention of a department, number 10, HMT, etc. When actually many people, in a public sense, would say the benefits that they're after are their homes being improved, their roads being improved, their bus services being improved. And those things, in a sense, I pick on you, Nick, because you seem to imply that big things make more difference. Most people would say small things make more difference. You know, productivity would be different if everybody in this room could touch type and was trained to touch type before they left school or college. That's a very small, albeit national thing. So maybe we got this the wrong way round. And I wonder, were there or are there any lessons you might take from neighbourhood planning, which does engage people at the first point of engagement and puts options in front of them, and which often gets more housing in local areas than a top-down target does? What might we learn from that way round?
Okay, thanks. Can we just take up another, hold that thought, another big things versus small things point here in the middle.
Hi, Simon Jeffrey from Centre for Cities. Probably building on what Stephen said and a couple of points about, you know, political support in areas, just trying to divide that between national infrastructure, and maybe the debate should be, you know, if what's going on in Greater Manchester, TfGM should be deciding on the infrastructure projects. Seeing as we're sticking on this, obviously TfL's got a lot of powers, but it still has to get signed off from Secretary of State. See the, you know, the muddle it's been putting over Crossrail 2 and the sort of impossible financing situation. You know, transport for the north, potential risk of, you know, huge amounts of money being spent on journeys that aren't going to affect the vast majority of journeys in the north, which are people getting in and out of centre of town or getting across to, you know, school education or anything like that. Is there a place for thinking a bit more almost federally, where the national infrastructure is actually delegated down to larger, you know, city region transport authorities on transport in particular, to try and, you know, square that circle of public engagement, smaller schemes having a greater impact, as well as people, you know, feeling like the rebalancing is having an impact in their lives that they can see in their city centres or in their commutes every day.
Great, let's take these two together, and then I'm going to start taking them in twos. There's a lot of hands up.
So just on that kind of, on the big project point, so the biggest mega projects are more likely to have transformational effects on the economy. That's not to say that they're likely to have a higher CBA or a higher impact. I think it's a slightly different thing. On the national policy statement, so we are relatively critical of some national policy statements, in that they tend to be quite vague, with little kind of indication of the kind of the areas of the country that they'll affect, and the fact that the members of the public often don't know when a national policy statement is being consulted on, that might mean a high-speed rail line going through their back garden, for example, which is why what we said with the Commission for Public Engagement, that we need far greater public involvement in that process, but also it needs to start earlier. So actually, when the National Infrastructure Commission is developing its national infrastructure assessment, I think to date it's been very good at engaging with kind of professionals. It's perhaps been less good at engaging with the public, so you need greater public engagement at that stage. When that national infrastructure assessment is translated into what we want to see a national infrastructure strategy, again, we think there's a role for the Commission for Public Engagement to run some kind of deliberative workshops with representative groups of the public to help decide between competing options. I think the evidence shows that if the public are supported, if there seems to be political support for whatever they're going to say at the end, then actually they can be helped and supported to think about kind of complex trade-offs associated with these investments. Then when the national policy statements are being consulted on, we would like the CPE to be identifying those communities that are likely to be affected and engaging them in that consultation process, and then again providing support to project sponsors when it goes through the NSIP regime. Going back to onto your point about devolution, I think part of the problem why central government is so focused on these big projects and why the country is so focused on these big projects, you're absolutely right, is because decision making on these projects is overly centralised. And we say in the report that the objective should be to devolve responsibilities and capacity at the same time. So those have to go hand in hand, because actually outside of Transport for Greater Manchester, outside TfL, actually there just isn't the capacity at the local level to take those on. But that shouldn't be a barrier. They can happen together, and actually if that did happen, and if the kind of the capacity of those organisations were built, then I think they're probably in a much better place to decide on things like regeneration than someone in Whitehall is, and they can ensure that transport is better connected up with housing developments and with other developments in the local area that are going to be essential for kind of maximising the benefits of those investments.
Lilian, is there a tension between what you described of wanting the big political rebalancing, if you like, decision to invest in part of the and the kind of call for local engagement and devolution that we've just heard?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I think there's definitely a place for devolution. Why would you not make the decisions closer to the people that they impact? But I think there's two things to that. One is that devolution by itself doesn't necessarily mean that there's proper local engagement and that people feel an ownership of it. So there's still more to do, as Nick said. And then the other is that, of course, then there'll be, there's a political decision or a debate about how much money gets devolved to different bodies and areas. So that's still a big question. I do think that by delegating responsibility and and devolving budgets, it does provide an opportunity for more innovation, because different places might approach it differently, and therefore for potential for more learning about what works and trying different approaches. So I think that there could be real positives around that approach.
Okay, great. Let's take another couple. Over here, very patiently on that side, and then I'm coming to the front here.
James Kidner from Improbable. We do large-scale simulation and relevant to all this. But I'm picking up a point in your report where you say that the UK consistently make poor decisions compared with some other wealthy countries. And I wanted to know who your sort of exemplary other states were, bearing in mind we have particular problems in this country because England's the most crowded country in Europe after Malta.
Many thanks. And over here.
Thank you. Julia Chen from the Department for Transport. One of the things that we're grappling with is how decision makers should account for significant uncertainty in the face of technological and other changes. For instance, how the emergence of autonomous vehicles might influence demand for different kinds of transport and the kinds of roads we need. I wondered if you could speak a bit about future-proofing infrastructure decisions and whether you looked at that in your report.
Many thanks. Two excellent questions. Nick, do you want to?
So in terms of which countries, we are ranked, I think, 26th in the world for the quality of our infrastructure. So there are quite a few countries that are doing this better than us. In terms of specific countries that we name, so we talk about France a lot, particularly the use of the CNDP, which has been a really effective way of delivering major infrastructure. It's been a great forum for kind of constructively debating completing these projects, and it's not only kind of reduced public opposition, but it's also led to improvements in the quality of the projects themselves, because project sponsors take on the views of local communities who might have excellent ideas about how to do it better. Another country that we cite, particularly in relation to how they use private finance, we talk about the Netherlands. In particular, they've got a kind of a much clearer pipeline of kind of upcoming projects. So those who want to invest have a much clearer idea about what's coming up, and they can upskill their teams accordingly. And then just one final one that we mentioned, I mentioned earlier, the kind of splitting of project sponsors from those who are kind of assessing and evaluating it. So we highlight the example of PMAC from South Korea, which does that very effectively.
And the future-proofing question, both of you.
I mean, I think that's a really good question, and I think it is incredibly difficult where you've got the potential for effectively disruptive technologies that could be absolutely transformative. I mean, one of the things that the Select Committee are wanting to do is to look at not just how potentially it could something like autonomous vehicles could change the way that we operate, but also what's the role of government in shaping the way in which new technologies change the way that societies operate to maximise wider benefit, rather than thinking, oh, all new technology is good, is actually, you know, there's a role for government in shaping it. But I think from the point of view of trying to plan long-term schemes, when we know that technology is changing really fast and potentially could be transformative, that is a real challenge. I don't know what Nick's answer would be around that one.
I think there's a phrase that predictions are difficult, especially about the future. And I think there's a problem about how the government communicates uncertainty. Obviously, particularly if you're thinking about what's going to happen 10, 20, 30 years down the line, it's incredibly difficult to do that well. But when government tends to talk about what its assumptions are, what it thinks is going to happen, it tends to say this is definitely what is going to happen. Inevitably, it doesn't end up quite happening like that. And actually, I think if government was clearer about uncertainty, you know, we highlight, for example, by OBR and the Bank of England, which kind of show things in kind of visually quite appealing fan charts that show how likely different outcomes are. And I think if government was clearer that these are our assumptions now, but things could change, actually that would make it a lot easier to change their minds further down the line, and you'd avoid kind of problems with being locked into projects that no longer seem to make sense.
Julia, do you want to say anything about how you do it?
I think I kind of agree with most points that have been made, and we're working on the future of urban mobility strategy this year to try and set out how it's going to be shaping these technological changes, but also doing internal work on trying to improve the decision-making processes so that we at least are getting teams to recognise more the uncertainty that's inherent to a lot of these decisions.
Thanks for the question. Over here towards the wall.
Thanks. Christine Quigley from GK Strategy. On the point about democratic accountability and the need to kind of balance the public benefit and the private impact of major programmes, I suppose one of the main ways we've got of doing that on major projects is through hybrid bills, which are sort of long and tortuous and don't come around that often. I was wondering if you had thoughts on maybe how those processes could be improved, or actually is that kind of the least worst option for making some of these decisions?
Great, thanks. Let's take one over here. There's suddenly two over here. Penny here, second from the wall.
James Harris from the Royal Town Planning Institute. I was wondering whether your research identified any changes that need to be made to the way that utilities are regulated, because one of the recommendations of the National Infrastructure Commission was that there might be some barriers there in terms of the way that utilities are planned and whether they could be changed to better support the delivery of housing. So just any comments on that?
Thanks very much.
So on the hybrid bill process, I must say we very much focused on the kind of the national policy statement, NSIP regime, rather than the kind of the hybrid bill process, though we do comment to say that, you know, it's quite archaic, and actually in terms of public engagement, you know, you have to put these complex petitions through, and actually the kind of the principle of development is normally agreed before the public can actually have their say on it. So we talked a little bit about how the kind of Commission for Public Engagement might facilitate greater public involvement in that process, but definitely I think we would support reform, though we haven't fully explored how that might be done properly. On the kind of regulation of utilities question, I'm afraid it's not something we've really looked at in any great detail.
There will be more work to come on from the Institute on that.
Yeah, and I'd agree about the hybrid bills. It is a really difficult process, and I think it's quite an inaccessible one for the public. Quite how we're going to, whether Parliament's going to look again at that, I'm not sure. But certainly I think there is a bit of an appetite about that, because we've haven't gone through a hybrid bill process. Well, we're obviously locked into that now for HS2, so we've got kind of 2 more to come. It's quite hard work.
All right, let me see if we can take it. There's more and more hands going up. We're coming towards the end. Right, over towards the fireplace. I'm doing these roughly in the order you've put your hands up, to the extent I can.
Thank you, Richard Barnes, Woodland Trust. Actually, the HS2 Phase 2 petition is looking a lot easier. They've done a much better process, forms easy to fill in, so that's one bit of good news. But I was going to ask about how you factor in, you talked about evidence and long-term thinking, about the environmental costs, especially in cost-benefit analysis. That's, and also the associated costs, such as air quality, health and well-being, particularly in the light of the desire to do infrastructure in a more environmentally sensitive way, and the 25-year plan that asks for environmental net gain. Thank you.
Many thanks indeed. Over by the wall here. And I'll try and take a few more as well. Yeah.
Hello, Adam Cooper from the National Infrastructure Commission. Thank you very much for the report and for the kind words you're saying so far about the NIC. And just generally, we would really welcome kind of more evidence and ideas and creativity in infrastructure. And so this report's very welcome for us. I guess my question is, again, around kind of devolution and local and national projects, but more around the institutions. And in particular, how do you make a national institution like one for public debate, or even the NIC, how do you make that relevant in all regions of the UK?
Okay, many thanks. Let me take, woman here.
My name is Emily Trepas. I work for Dialogue by Design, and we help with sort of independent consultation engagement on national infrastructure projects. And I believe that sort of national infrastructure planning and the approach has always been, in terms of engagement, to look at issues, to make sure that developers are having account of all issues raised by the public during consultation processes. And I was just wondering if you had any comments on perhaps the knock-on effect of sort of public expectation. Now we're seeing in sort of housing and estate regeneration, with Sadiq Khan coming out in favour of balloting the public at the end of a process. Just if you have any comments on that.
Okay, great. And is there a final one we'll squeeze in? So really at the end. Right, here, second from the aisle. We'll just get these in.
Thank you. My name's Doreen McIntyre. I'm a member of the public who has actually attempted to engage with HS2 for 8 years now, including a hybrid bill process, the Dialogue by Design consultations and the rest. My question really is very simple. How much appetite, genuine appetite, is there for a commission for public engagement? As a member of the public, I'm very excited by that, but I would want to know, how would it get hardwired into the decision-making processes, the outcomes of that engagement, given that the rest of them have failed so far?
Many thanks indeed, a great question. So we've got the environmental cost, how they take account of in cost-benefit analysis, more on devolution, the institutions, public expectations, and public engagement. Is it what politicians really need, or is it in fact the last thing they want? Lilian, let me start with you.
Well, I mean, first of all, the question from the Woodland Trust, and I think it's a really interesting point, and certainly in terms of our work as a select committee scrutinising the MPS, that has been one of the areas where we focused a lot of questions about how should we and can we properly monetise impacts on the environment, whether it's noise or air quality or or carbon emissions. And I think I hope it is that the process of going through it is actually going to be helpful, because certainly we've focused, I think, hopefully some quite difficult questions at the Department for Transport. We've got them coming in tomorrow, so we'll see whether we get good answers. But I think it has been one of the areas that I think requires more work for us to have some certainty around that, and we know how important, and it's certainly gone up the political agenda, particularly issues around air quality. So I think there is more focus on how we do those things accurately and how we take them into account in making decisions. So that's good. I mean, interesting to hear you kind of have that experience of trying to engage with HS2, which I know isn't always been an easy process, and there's a lot to do better. Well, speaking for myself, the idea of a Commission for Public Engagement, I think, is really important, and it goes back to the question back there as well, is if we're going to make the National Infrastructure Commission relevant to all parts of the country and relevant to all people, and people to feel they have a real say, then I think we need to do much better at communication. It is about trying to explain why these things might matter to someone who's sitting you know, in their local community, and their concerns might be very, very immediate and local to them. So you've got to kind of somehow make the connection between something that feels quite distant but actually will have an impact on them, and I think, you know, that is quite a skill. And if a commission can find a way to kind of marry up those national decisions that have very broad but dispersed effects, and what are the concerns of people in their individual, you know, in their individual lives, and find a way to engage them in making choices and feeling that they can exercise some sort of control, because I think it's the lack of feeling any sense of control that people find the most difficult, then I think that would be hugely valuable, and I think the report would be really helpful in starting that conversation, but obviously there's quite a lot of work that needs to be done to get from the concept and the idea to the reality, and, you know, it operating effectively on the ground. But I think I certainly think there should be a real interest in that, and we'll be thinking about how we can take that suggestion forward.
I mean, we certainly have a strong appetite for the suggestion that we made, and we have to work with Lilian and others on how we can develop that further. On the kind of environment point, you're right, these are some of the concerns, particularly those in local areas that they're most interested in. I think one of the things that we point out in the report is the need to incorporate those kind of non-monetary impacts into CBAs in a consistent way, which isn't always the case, and also to learn from best practice. So, for example, I suspect that DEFRA might be a bit better at this than other departments. So, you know, where they have models that can be used to try and draw on those. On the public engagement point, I think the thing that we found is that the public's most interested in kind of the sense of fairness, and actually they need to feel that they've had a say kind of as early on as possible before a decision has been made. As the gentleman said earlier, that it's not just about the kind of the colour of the fence, that they're involved in kind of fundamental decisions about what a project looked like, or indeed whether there should be a project at all. So I must say I haven't looked in detail at the balloting measures, but from what we've looked at, actually engagement earlier will tend to be more effective than kind of signing off things at a later date. And finally, in terms of the question about how to make national institutions relevant to the local. So as I said earlier, I think a part of that is about devolving further powers to the regional and to the sub-regional, and indeed in developing national plans, that actually the views of those sub-national bodies should be taken very, very seriously indeed, and actually it should be more of a kind of a partnership approach. So for example, in future years I would think that the work of Transport for the North and Transport for Greater Manchester should be heavily influencing whatever it is that the National Infrastructure Commission then says should happen at a national level, and part of the role should be to kind of connect up the patchwork of local plans rather than to kind of be imposing a single national vision in areas where they've already developed their own ideas and perhaps have already engaged the public on those.
Thanks for that. We're going to have to draw to a close now. This has been fascinating. Inevitably quite focused on transport with a bit of housing rather than perhaps energy or digital. And because of that, we've heard a lot about public engagement and institutions. And thank you. I've taken much support for our idea from this discussion, to be continued, and also on our part to be continued on the finance questions, which we haven't dug into quite so deeply in this particular discussion, but about the public versus private. Does it make a difference? When is which one better? I can put it that way. Something that we will be looking at in all kinds of contexts later this year. And for those of you particularly interested in this question of independence of institutions, we have Robert Choate, chair of the OBR, here at lunchtime today and in conversation with me. Do watch on our live stream if you're not coming. With that, can I thank again the Project Management Institute, Lilian, Nick, and the terrific IFG team. Thank you.